Today we are in Faversham in Kent, England. Not to talk about it being the oldest historic market town in Kent, first recorded in the Domesday Book in 1086, or to talk about the extensive history of brewing in the area. No, today we are here to talk about William Shakespeare and the brutal murder of a man known as Thomas Arden. And no, Shakespeare never went on a little jaunt southeast from London to murder a man he'd never met. But there is a very real possibility that he wrote a play called Arden of Faversham, a play that told the story of that very murder. Today we are going to find out more about that murder and the play it inspired, and find out whether that anonymous play really was one of Shakespeare's earliest works. This is the story of Arden of Faversham. Now, first things first, apologies if I look just dead on my feet. I have a 5-day-old girl in the house while I'm trying to record this, so I probably should have left it a bit longer, but gotta get on that grind. So, I think we can all agree that William Shakespeare was definitely one of the greatest playwrights to have ever lived. Regardless of whether you think he actually wrote all of the plays that he's credited with, he was pretty good at it. And if for some reason you've been living under a rock and you don't know who he was an Elizabethan playwright who wrote an incredible number of incredibly influential plays that still influence all of our theatre, cinema, just general storytelling to this day. And his works have been influencing everything for over 4 centuries. But despite the huge number of plays we are pretty sure he did write, you might not be aware of one lesser known play that is kind of hiding in plain sight. The play Arden of Faversham, or Faversham as it's called today, is a gripping Elizabethan true crime drama. In fact, some people think it might be one of the first examples of a true crime play, or something that was influenced by a real life crime. And this play has sparked a centuries-long debate because it was authored anonymously, meaning we don't actually know for sure who wrote it. Nobody ever put their name to the play. But scholars have been asking for centuries, did Shakespeare write it? And Shakespeare is just one of the options. There are a number of authors who have been linked to this play, and it's not known whether it was written by just one person or maybe actually it was a collaboration, the work of multiple different authors and scriptwriters coming together. But nobody knows for sure. But there are some key points that do lead to Shakespeare having some involvement. And we're going to find out what those are. And actually a little bit about the real life murder that inspired the play. So, the play itself. What's it about? When did it come out? What do we know for sure about the play? Arden of Faversham was an anonymous play first published in 1592, which, if Shakespeare was involved, would make it one of his earliest works. It tells the true story of the murder of Thomas Arden, a former mayor of Faversham, and an event and an incident so scandalous and so sinister that it fascinated Elizabethan audiences at the time. So, what happened? Why was this murder so infamous? And why did it grip the Elizabethans so much so that somebody or some people, or William Shakespeare, had to write a play about it? Well, the real life murder took place on Sunday, February 15th, 1550, so about 40 years before the play was written. And enough time for the murder to really seep into, everybody's subconscious. Everybody knew about this. And as we've mentioned, Thomas Arden was a former mayor of Faversham. He was a landowner in his mid-50s. And at the time, he was still living in Faversham, which is in Kent, England, if you're unfamiliar with the region. And his wife Alice, who was about 30 years younger than Thomas Arden, was, shall we say, maybe a little bit less than satisfied with their marriage, and was described as tall and of well-favoured shape and countenance, which basically just means she was attractive in the 1500s. And unfortunately, Alice's dissatisfaction with her marriage to Thomas led her to fall in love with a servant from a neighbouring household, a man named Thomas Mosby, or Mosby, not sure. You pick whichever one you like better. And they began an affair that carried on for so long and was so publicly known that even Thomas eventually found out about it. But, and maybe this gives you some insight into the nature of their relationship, or into the nature of, I don't know, the character of Thomas Arden, but once he'd found out about their affair, he was so desperately in love with and completely enamored with his wife that he basically capitulated. He accepted all of her denials. Despite the obvious fact that they were definitely having an affair. I mean, he even tried to be friends with Mosby, inviting him to stay in the house with them, to spend time with them, all three of them together. I mean, this relationship was bizarre. And it clearly got to the point where Alice was done with it. She just wanted to be with Mosby. So she decided to do something about it. And in classic true crime fashion, so if you know anything about women serial killers or just women who kill, they very much tended to err towards a more subtle art of murder. That usually meaning poison. And so Alice found a local painter who apparently knew something about poison, and he prepped her the poison she intended to kill her husband with, telling her to put it in with his porridge. And the crucial instruction was she needed to put it below the porridge and then pour the milk on top of it. And here was her first misstep, although she obviously did go on to successfully murder her husband, but not this time. Her first misstep was when she was putting together her husband's breakfast, she poured the milk first and added the poison last. And some of you might be able to see the inherent problem with this. As soon as Thomas Arden sat down to eat his potentially lethal porridge, the first mouthful was just poison. And he immediately noticed how disgusting it was and vomited it all back up again. So, attempt number 1 failed. Now, apparently either Thomas Arden was so gullible that he just had no idea what was happening after that first attempt, but everything carried on as normal, and Alice kept trying to kill him. As she tried to involve his own valet, she tried to hire professional assassins, and there were numerous unsuccessful attempts to assassinate him, until they finally hatched on the idea that worked. And if their failed attempts so far were any indication, the one that worked wasn't exactly seamless. In fact, it was a complete mess. And it happened during that stormy night in February 1550. Arden was sitting down in his home for supper, and he was actually dining with Mosby. Yep, Mosby was still just hanging around in their house, eating with them, doing whatever. Like, seriously, what Thomas Arden couldn't see or was expecting to happen in this situation, like, I don't know what he was thinking. He sat there with his wife's lover having dinner. I mean, it was the 1500s. There were a lot of interesting relationships going on. Like, there's even a chance, this is just pure speculation, there's even a chance that, 1500s, maybe Thomas Arden was gay and the marriage was just kind of one big cover-up and she was fed up with it. But, I mean, still going to the lengths of killing him is a completely different story. The relationship was weird. So, on that fateful night, Thomas Arden is sat with Thomas Mosby having supper. What he was completely oblivious to was the fact that a man named Black Will, a notorious local ruffian, was hiding in a nearby closet. At some point, a man named Michael, who was Thomas Arden's valet, locked the front door of the house and stood behind Arden with a candlestick. So at this point, Arden is surrounded. He's got Mosby, who's obviously in on the whole scheme, opposite him. He's got his valet stood behind him, and he's got this thug, Black Will, which is still a great name, hiding in the closet. And Mosby was the man to signal go time. And when he did, Black Will burst out of the closet with a towel in hand, which he wrung around Arden's neck and started to strangle him with it. But that wasn't enough. Mosby, obviously kind of desperate to see that the job got done this time, cracked him over the head with a pressing iron, all while Black Will was still strangling him. Once Black Will was done strangling him, he pulled out a knife and he slashed him across the throat. This is when Alice emerged and decided to get in on the act. I mean, this sounded like a bit of a frenzy. I'm guessing all those previous failed attempts had really got their backs up and they were really desperate to actually kill him this time. Because Alice came in with a knife and she stabbed him 7 or 8 times in the chest. And once that was done, once basically everybody had got their hands bloodied in this horribly chaotic, messy murder, Black Will, the hired ruffian who was obviously just there to do a job, mugged the corpse, basically stole all of his money from his pockets, his jewelry, everything, and then demanded his payment he was owed from Alice, and then disappeared off into the night. Once Black Will had scarpered, Alice and a maid, who was now, if she hadn't been in on it before, she was definitely in on it now, helped Alice clean up the parlour. Then they took the bloodied rags that they used to clean, the knife, and they threw them into the well in the courtyard. Whilst they were on cleanup detail, everybody else was trying to get rid of the body. And when I say everybody else, I mean Michael the valet, Susan, another maid, and Mosby's sister, who was also just a part of this now too. Like, everybody was just rocking up to help out. They carried the dead body into an adjoining field. And remember, this was a stormy night. When I say stormy, I mean snowstorm. It was a blizzard outside. So there was a lot of cover. They had cover of darkness and they had cover of snow. The snowfall was very heavy, so they were expecting it to cover their tracks. So once they got the body to the field, they laid it on its back, still in its nightgown and slippers, and left him there, expecting all of the trail, their footprints, everything to be covered by the snow. Then they went back to the house, and that's when Alice sent out her servants into the town to inquire about Thomas's whereabouts, because she was so desperately worried about him and he hadn't come home. And when neighbours found out, they came to the house and Alice was there in tears, putting on a real show for everybody. And once enough of a fuss had been kicked up and a search party involving the current mayor of the time was sent out to try and discover any evidence of where Thomas Arden might be, they almost immediately found his body in the field next to the house. And because the snow had stopped falling, they saw the footprints leading from the body back to the house. And then next to the house, they found his blood and some of his hair. And obviously now pretty suspicious, when they searched the home, they almost immediately found the knife and the bloody rags that had been thrown into the well. And as soon as they found the murder weapon, Alice confessed everything and gave up all of her accomplices. I mean, these guys were useless. Sure, they'd finally managed to kill Thomas Arden, but it had taken them so many rubbish attempts. And by the time they actually did it, it was the messiest, stupidest murder I think I've ever heard of. Like, they involved so many people and they made such a mess. They put the body in the field next to the house and they hid the murder weapon in the courtyard. Like, idiots. So immediately, Alice, Michael the valet, and her 2 maids were sent to prison. They found Mosby almost immediately. He'd just gone to an inn to spend the night and pretend he'd been there, all night. And when they also found drops of blood on Mosby's stockings, he immediately confessed because he too was an idiot. And this is where we get to the trial. All the prisoners were obviously convicted of the crime. It was very clear that they'd done it. Michael the valet was hanged. One of the maids was actually burned alive. Mosby and his sister, or remember his sister got involved as well, don't forget that. They were both hanged as well. Alice, Thomas's wife, was also burned. Feels like they really saved the bad executions for Alice and the maid. And as for Black Will, he'd made it all the way to the Netherlands, which in the 1500s is, fair play, good effort. But they still found him, and he too was burnt in the Netherlands. So that's the story of the real murder. A complete shit show of an event where everything went wrong and they bungled the whole thing basically, despite actually managing to kill him in the end. There's a very cool church here at Faversham. Had to find a church, you know how it goes. It's not really one of my out and about videos if I haven't visited a graveyard at some point. That's a point, actually. I don't know how old this church is. I wonder if it's old enough that this is where they buried Thomas Arden. Well, behind me is Arden's house. Here is where the brutal murder of Thomas Arden took place. And once he was dead, his body was dragged off into apparently an adjacent field. There are no longer any adjacent fields around here, it's all houses, so I can only assume, look for the most modern houses, and that's probably where the field used to be. So I'm just going to assume that over there behind me is the field that his body was left in. Just learned from the information sign that's here across the road that they actually put on the play in the back garden of Arden's house, which is great. I need to come to that the next time that happens. I wonder if they play out the murder in the kitchen where the murder actually took place. It is mad to think that, I mean, this is why I love history, that in this house behind me, you know, like 500 years ago, some dude was stabbed to death. It's also crazy to think of this place, which is now completely hemmed in by other houses, which are, you know, some of them are as old, and a lot of them are still pretty old. But obviously back then, when Thomas Arden was murdered, it was pretty much surrounded by fields and surrounded by the grounds of the old abbey that was in the process of being torn down thanks to Henry VIII. This place used to look very different. I mean, to the point where, you know, like, murderers nowadays would probably look at this and think, yeah, we're going to get caught if we kill this dude and drag him out of the house. Someone's going to see us. Whereas then it was one house very much kind of isolated, still very much in the centre of Faversham, but there wasn't a lot else around, nowhere near as much around as there is now. So they felt a lot more able to just do what they did and just drag him into a field over the road. I mean, that is still pretty lazy though. Even if it was the 1500s, I mean, like, come on dudes. Maybe try and hide the body a little bit further away than an adjacent field. It's snowing, it's fine. The snow will just cover up any of the blood or our footprints. Some people get caught for a reason. Ultimately, I think the takeaway here is everybody involved in this murder was a complete idiot. The play itself essentially recounts exactly what we've discussed then. It's a pretty close adaptation of the real event, with some haphazard attempts to kill Thomas Arden and, you know, some extra flourishes, a couple of extra characters here and there, but for the most part, it's basically what happened. So, this is where we get to Shakespeare's supposed authorship of the play. So, when the play was originally released in the 1590s, there was no author. The first time we actually had an edition released that had a claimed author was an edition that was released in 1770, which boldly claimed the play as a Shakespeare play. Basically, it seems like one of the earliest reasons for it being thought that this was a Shakespeare play was simply the fact that it was so eloquently and maturely written compared to other playwrights of the time that nobody thought it could be anyone other than Shakespeare. Shakespeare was the standard, and this play was written so well that nobody could imagine anyone else, especially somebody that we don't know of, could have written it. It's been said that the play's elegant verse and psychological depth most closely compare to some of Shakespeare's other works like Titus Andronicus. The wonderful mix of layered and complex characters, struggling with complex emotions and situations, and a very, very dark subject matter, which is also sprinkled with a very kind of Shakespearean humour. All of these are indications of the future works of the great playwright. But I've also seen it posited that this play, having all those hallmarks of a mature, proper Shakespeare play, are also indications that this play was not a young man's work. And Shakespeare would have been a younger man and, you know, far less experienced if he actually wrote this. The idea that this would have come before some of Shakespeare's earliest plays and yet demonstrated a maturity and a quality that would only be seen in, future prime Shakespeare plays is indicative of the fact that maybe it's unlikely that this was actually Shakespeare. Then you also have little clues, little pointers to the authorship of this play. I mean, is it a coincidence that the two ruffians in the play, one of whom is obviously Black Will from the true story, Black Will, and then the second ruffian added for the play is Shakebag. So you've got Black Will and Shakebag. Will, Shake, who knows? Might just be a fun little coincidence. Then more recently, people have attempted to use technology to more closely identify the potential authorship of the play. So using, and I have to read this, modern computational studies and stylometric analysis have detected linguistic markers in Arden of Faversham that closely resemble Shakespeare's known plays. So basically they ran the play through some kind of analysis software that looked for patterns and styles and tried to match them to the plays that we know Shakespeare wrote. And they found matches, maybe more matches than might be coincidence. And interestingly, which, depending on which angle you come at it from, either gives it more credibility or less credibility, is the fact that they don't attribute the entire play to Shakespeare, more the middle chapters. The middle chapters apparently closer resemble future Shakespeare works, which again would indicate that collaboration between potentially Shakespeare and some other playwrights. And collaboration during the 16th century was pretty common. And it's argued that this was a joint effort, and Shakespeare's part of that was more kind of focused towards the psychological profiles of the characters and some of the poetic depth to the writing. And some have even narrowed it down to particular soliloquies or particular dramatic confrontations in the play that most closely resemble work by Shakespeare. So it may be that he only actually contributed individual sections of dialogue or certain particular scenes or speeches. So he might not have even written chapters of this. He may have just been asked to, oh, hey, Will, can you throw in a soliloquy here for us? Because I suck at soliloquies. If it was Shakespeare, why didn't he put his name on it? And that's pretty straightforward. If it was Shakespeare, it was a very early work, and he was probably not as prominent as he became at the time it released. So putting Shakespeare's name on it would not have made that much of a difference. So ultimately, we don't know if Shakespeare wrote this play. There are patterns that match up. There are patterns of speech that match or feel familiar. There's a maturity to the writing that if it wasn't Shakespeare, then there was some other playwright out there who was just as incredible as Shakespeare at the time. Or this was just a random group of playwrights who got together and wrote something better than any of them could create individually. But despite all of the doubt and nothing being really concrete, that hasn't stopped this play being attributed to Shakespeare and included in selections of Shakespeare's works for centuries. And it is still performed to this day and connected to William Shakespeare. So regardless of whether he wrote it or not, or even wrote a tiny part of it or not, this play will forever be connected with William Shakespeare. And you know what? I kind of like that. It gives the play a whole separate mysterious narrative outside of the pages themselves, off the stage itself. And the play itself is still a good play. It's just a good true crime play, and one of the earliest examples of a true crime play. And as some have pointed out, a play that at that point was unusual for the fact that it focused on smaller characters, real people with real lives, and not kings and queens and high drama. This was gritty, real life murder. And you add to that mix this sprinkling of Shakespeare mystery, and you start to see why this whole play and everything surrounding it is so interesting. And hey, maybe one day we'll find something in Faversham, maybe a little marker on Thomas Arden's house that claims Will Shakespeare was here 1585. And that might help us solve this mystery once and for all. So, what do you think? Let me know in the comments whether you think Shakespeare was involved. And as always, thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. That stuff really helps my channel out. And I'll see you in the next one.